Yeah, I think it's 2 p.m., so it's time to start. And please come forward. There are some seats available here in the front. But warmly welcome to everyone and good afternoon. Also warmly welcome to our online audience and of course to our distinguished speakers and all of you here in the room to this seminar on Liberating the United Nations, its founding history and future role. I'm Helene Maria Kyed, and I'm a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, also known as DIIS. And it's really a great pleasure both for me, but of course also for DIIS to be holding this event today on the United Nations and also right at this time, because of course it's always important to talk about the UN and its future, but I feel that it's particularly timely right now. Not only will the UN celebrate its 80th birthday next year, there was also just held a high-level event in New York this week, a Summit of the Future hosted by the UN Secretary General. And also, since we are in Copenhagen, Denmark will also soon take up a 2-year seat in the United Nations Security Council. In the invitation to this seminar, we highlighted the crisis of legitimacy that the UN is facing today and the increased questioning of the UN's ability to live up to its founding mandate of preventing wars and upholding international law. And I think this questioning is not least reinforced by the ongoing wars in Gaza and the Ukraine. But we also highlighted in the invitation that perhaps never before is there a need for an organization like the UN to tackle some of the pressing challenges that we are facing globally in terms of changing world order, in terms of the climate crisis and other ongoing challenges. Many civil society voices, but also national leaders, including what we sometimes refer to as the great powers, have also made different calls, although definitely not always agreeing, to the need to reform the UN in order to be able to still tackle the global challenges. And today that's what we are partly going to do, maybe not resolve everything, but at least we are going to discuss what a future UN could look like and what the challenges to reform the UN are. To answer those questions, we also need to understand the history of the UN, the founding mandates, and the geopolitical dynamics that have shaped the way that the UN has been able to act and make an importance over these past 80 years of its existence. And we are very fortunate today, I would say extremely lucky today, to have with us two renowned and also long-term UN experts, but also international scholars at the same time, Professor Richard Falk and Dr. Hans von Sponeck. And next to Professor Falk, also our own Louise Andersen, here from DIIS, also from the Danish Ministry of MFA, who is one of our primary UN experts in Denmark. And next to her, Myat Thet Thitsar, who will also bring her perspective on the UN from Myanmar. So the sort of occasion for this seminar and the reason that we were able to convince these two gentlemen, Professor Falk and Dr. Hans von Sponeck, to come here is that they have recently published this amazing book. I finished reading it now. It's very rich. It's very informative. It is called, as you can read here, Liberating the United Nations, Realism with Hope. And it was published by Stanford University Press a few months back. And I personally feel very fortunate that they are willing to also launch it here at DIIS in the little country of Denmark and city of Copenhagen. We're going to hear a lot about the book, but for me at least, it offers a deep historical insight into how the various parts of the UN system has evolved from the time of its formation after the Second World War. And also, very importantly, it tracks all these different critical junctures in world politics that have shaped what the UN has become today and the challenges that it has faced. I also like that it doesn't only criticize the UN or provides forms of diagnosis about the UN, but also is trying in very sort of tangible ways to look at how the UN can become more effective, legitimate, and accountable. and to tackle the challenges that we are facing today. So in our program, we will first have Professor Falk and Dr. Hans von Sponeck in the other order. I can see Hans is now not agreeing with what I'm saying. I told them to raise their finger if I was saying something that they didn't agree with. And so it will be Dr. Hans von Sponeck first, and then Professor Richard Falk, who will present main takeaways from their book. And then that would be followed by Louise Riis Andersen, who will comment and discuss the book. She has also read it from cover to cover, I believe. After that, Myat Thet Thitsar will bring her perspective on the UN scene from the position of a Myanmar citizen and also a Myanmar scholar. We will then have a Q&A session where you will also have a possibility to interact with the panelists, and we will then finish the program at 4 p.m. or at 1600 hours. I will also say that after the seminar, there's a possibility to buy this amazing book at a discounted price. It's lying on the table right there with a mobile pay number. If you want to pay cash, please pay to the young gentleman here. But that is, of course, up to you, but the possibility is there. And before I present the distinguished speakers, I also just want to very quickly mention that this seminar is part of what we call the UN Peace and Security Studies at the Danish Institute for International Studies, or DIIS, which is funded by and done for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially the multilateral office where Louise also comes from. And we've done several different studies for this funding, and we've also done events like today. And topics include climate, peace and security, women, peace and security, disarmament, peace operation, and so on, where we've tried to sort of produce policy briefs and reports that hopefully will be able to, in one way or the other, inform Denmark during the UN Security Council candidacy or membership that starts in January this year. And I also want to briefly just advertise a seminar we are having next week on disarmament and arms control, also focused on the UN, and you will find the report fresh from press lying around that you can freely take copies of. But as I said, the launch of it itself will be next week on 1st of October. So now a presentation of the speakers, and I could probably take the rest of the time of this seminar if I was going to mention all the impressive work and contributions that Professor Richard Falk and Dr. Hans von Sponeck have made during their long careers. So I've had to make short summaries of it for this presentation, so they will also have time to present their book. So Professor Richard Falk is a renowned international law and international relations scholar. He currently holds a Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, and he also held the position as UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories in the past, and worked on the Independent International Commission on Kosovo. And Professor Falk also chairs the board of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and was on the advisory board of the World Federalist Institute and the American Movement for World Government. He has produced an impressive amount of books, both edited volumes and single-authored book, and I can't mention all of them here, but just a few of them include Public Intellectual, Human Rights Horizons, and the Decline of World Order. And we feel really, really honored to have you here today, Professor Falk, and that you were willing and happy to come and present the book that you have written together with Hans-Christoph von Sponeck today. And I'm also especially delighted to have you here, Dr. Hans von Sponeck, not only because this is your second time to speak at DIIS, so we are creating a tradition here, but also because you several months back agreed to my charm offensive of trying to get you to come here and present this amazing book today. And Mr. von Sponeck worked for the United Nations. I thought initially it was 35 years, but it was 32 years that you worked for the United Nations, especially the UNDP, including as res rep or resident representative in several countries, such as Pakistan and India. And towards of the end of your career, you also served as United Nations Assistant Secretary General under Kofi Annan when he was the Secretary General, and he was also UN humanitarian coordinator from Iraq until 2000 when he resigned from the UN. And he's written a very, very interesting book that I also recommend reading on his experiences in Iraq called A Different Kind of War from 2006, I believe. Then we have our own, I say our own, because Louise Riis Andersen, next to Professor Falk, is actually a chief advisor at the moment in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also has a history there from long ago, but she was also, and we were fortunate to also have Louise here for quite a lot of years as a researcher, senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and she's promised to come back. She's only on leave. And Louise is I would say our key person, not only on UN, but also on multilateralism. And she's also done a lot of work on Danish foreign policy and global order. And she is the award-winning scholar of a very interesting article called Curb Your Enthusiasm, Middle Power, Liberal Internationalism and the Future of the United Nations. So we are also lucky that she agreed to come today to comment on this book. Finally, I have Myat Thet Thitsar, who is, like Louise, also a close colleague and friend. She is the coordinator of the Enlightened Myanmar Research Foundation in Myanmar, which before the military coup in 2021 was a very active research organization. Now it is operating under the name Neon Corridor because it is no longer possible to do free and independent research in Myanmar, as she will probably come back to in her presentation. She is also doing currently a PhD at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and she's published and done research on politics, governance, justice, and ethnic minorities, and she's also written an essay in this book. This book has at the end of it several essays by younger, intellectual, progressive voices from various countries, both in the global south and the global north. And I also really recommend you reading those. And I think it also shows how the authors of the book are also interested in these kinds of voices and not only in their own authoritative expert knowledge. But I will now stop my presentation and hand over the word to you, Hans. Yeah, thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? No. If I speak, you don't hear me? I see voices, no? We can hear you, but I think the mic is... Now it's on. Good, thank you. I just wanted to say the very first words that I want to mention here are thanks to the Danish Institute for International Studies. Especially to you, Dr. Kyed, or better for me, Helene, and Dr. Andersen, or better for me, Louise. I have to mention you also, Myat Thet, because you are an indefatigable fighter for freedom of Burma. I salute you for that. And I didn't expect, I'm very happy, that Ambassador Loy, whom I knew from before as a tough Danish ambassador and UN colleague in Liberia, that she is here. And I also want to mention, I'd forgotten him, but we met in Yangon, and this is Jørgen Christensen, who is here today. And all of you, I want to thank for having come together to hear two old men to say something about an incredibly valuable organization. And I would be wrong if I wouldn't also mention you, Professor Hilal Elver, former special rapporteur on the rights for food, UN, who's no longer in that function but is fighting on for the kind of values that I think we share here in this room. And last but not least, I'm happy that you're here, Mark. Mark is my son, and Mark and I have gone through many years of interesting and sometimes very difficult journeys in different parts of the world. So I'm happy that you are here. I have now said something and used time, and I want to ask both Louise and you that you do not count this against the 20 minutes that I have, because I need the 20 minutes. And with that, I want to begin to try and cover little threads, little pieces. Anyone who, like you, have read this, I keep saying if you read one page a day, by Christmas 2025, you have read the book. So it's a big book, it's a heavy book, and whatever comes out of it, Richard and I, we started as friends and we ended up as very deep friends. Our friendship grew from page to page, and I'm very grateful for that. What I want to say briefly is, first of all, it's a very good omen that we have this meeting here in the best tradition of Scandinavian leadership on multilateral affairs. I hope it stays that way. There are signs in this part of the world, in Scandinavia, that there are developments, including in Denmark, which are not quite what I had hoped as a United Nations official, former official, to take place. Important to Richard and me throughout the period of writing was the we. We didn't want to have a simplistic division of labor, but wanted to write this book together. On 2nd July this year, when Stanford University Press published our book, we had exchanged during 5 years some 4,000, it's not an invented figure, 4,000 emails, made hundreds of phone calls, met on 3 continents. We agreed, we disagreed, we fought, we compromised, we removed the rough edges from the manuscript, but we always had time to laugh together. We have compared the United Nations to a tree and decided to trace this tree from the time the seedling was selected by Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin in 1945 in Yalta to its current condition as a fully grown tree with many branches. One thing was clear to us here. The 3 statesmen had not chosen an evergreen tree, but a fruit tree. It was our challenge to identify the kind of fruit it carries, who harvested it, who ate it, and what diseases endangered its growth. Leaving the metaphor aside, I've selected 3 areas of our work as they are of particular significance in the debate about the future of the United Nations. Throughout our book, we have made a clear distinction between the UN as a political body and the UN as an operational identity. That should never be forgotten. People who start talking to me about the UN, I always say, which UN do you mean? So there is a tremendous difference between what we see about the political UN, I will refer to that, and the operational UN. But there are a few basics that I would like to identify here as we went about to write this book. Our personal geopolitical ideology would have absolutely no place in our writings. So it's very important that this is accepted. We also needed a reliable database to allow credible analysis. Won't go into details what that has meant. Knuckle work, I would say. Thousands of pages had to be looked at to get the data that we needed. Alternatives. We were clear. We didn't want prescriptions. We wanted alternatives that would come out from our findings. The canvas of our global governance review would be much broader than the UN's interaction with governments, for sure. To make this point, we included in the book a chart identifying the impressive, really truly impressive global network that exists today between the UN legislative and judicial bodies, the UN operational system of specialized agencies, funds and programs, and a wide range of other partners. There are many other partners out there, such as civil society organizations, NGOs, academia, and also the private sector. We wanted to include in our research also, Dr. Kyed has referred to this, intergenerational collaboration between us and the younger people. Thank God there are also here younger people. Here is one representative, one of 9 voices, by the way, 8 of which are women, 1 a man, 1 man, and so a clear majority for gender-sensitive representation. We wanted to, apart from that, we wanted to make sure that in looking at intergeneral collaboration, we concern ourselves also with the Sustainable Development Goals, the handling of major global challenges such as climate change, human migration, and a topic we cannot escape. In any multilateral discussion, you cannot today escape the issue of poverty, and examine the links between the global and the local with a special focus on the significance of local knowledge. In my 32 years, I wish I had been sensitive and responsible enough to understand, living in these countries, the importance of local knowledge. If you leave local knowledge out, you can forget about getting it right in developing relevant projects at the national level. Lastly, for good reason, for very good reason, and you will appreciate that, we would review publications containing serious, really serious dis- and misinformation, including deliberately falsified documents. 3 country-specific chapters in this respect: Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, with whom we had particular in-depth experience, would identify the geopolitical peace and security consequence such falsified information would have worldwide. The book shows that this is what we have done. I think I'd like to stress, in other words, we fulfilled the challenges in that respect that are outlined that we had set for ourselves. Here now are some insights how the UN liberation process has evolved and the challenges that are inherent in this process. We have looked at how UN specialized agencies, funds and programs have cooperated during the past decades, 8 decades, and concluded good news. Thank God we have also good news, that the system has come a very long way from. In 1968, I started as a young civil servant in Ghana. Splendid isolation. Everyone did what they felt they wanted to do in the UN system. WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO, they all did what they had in mind. But there was absolutely no link between us except through financing. Financing UNDP, there was some linkage, but other than that, there was isolation. And today, we have a broad interagency integration one can report, with the result It's not exaggerated when I say today many country offices have one UN system program headed by one official, the UN resident coordinator, working with one budget, being housed in one building, and that is a good trend. It's not universal yet, but it is a clear trend in many countries, as I have just outlined it. In the interest of responsible use of scarce resources and to avoid duplication of effort, this valuable progress that we can report, we argue, should culminate in making such integration not voluntary, but obligatory, mandatory. I would like to add that the World Bank, let's not forget the World Bank is a UN agency, is the odd one out, since the bank is, at its free will, unfortunately, not an integral part of UN country teams. To add, the bank has often to be reminded by its UN counterparts, such as UNICEF and UNDP, particularly those two, that its demands for structural adjustment of economic policy must, without question, be structural adjustment with a human face. That the bank keeps forgetting. Richard and I, we fully share this view that I've just referred to. But there is another level of UN link-up, which in a political context is significantly more complex. And that is the partnership of UN political and peacekeeping missions concerned with conflict prevention and peace building and the UN country programs that are concerned with economic and social development. Let me repeat this. Linkages in the system, good progress. Linkages between the Security Council, that is the political UN, the General Assembly, and the country teams moving in the right direction, but there's a lot of improvement that has to take place. At a 2012 UN General Assembly report on this subject, I didn't know that Ambassador Löw would be here, but citing Liberia as a successful example, concludes that such partnership, I hope Dr. Löw will agree, are critical for ending crisis conditions at the country level. A conclusion we can only support. But we not only share it, but we suggest that such partnership between the political side and the operational side should be an important part of the UN reform debate. We have pointed out that for many decades there was a bright red line that existed between the political and the security-related agendas of the Security Council and the General Assembly and the work of the specialized agencies, funds and programs. To cross this line would have grave consequences for the trespasser, as we, both of us, experienced ourselves. I cannot forget the letter that I received in Baghdad from an Undersecretary General in New York, reprimanding me in very strong words for having organized a meeting between the Kurdish Autonomous Authority in northern Iraq and the Baghdad government to settle disagreements about the national electricity grid, which was threatening national integrity. Every UN resolution you can read about from those days talks about the importance of national integrity. And when it came down to a test, those people for us who were working in the trenches, who had a direct access to the issue, we were not allowed to open our mouth. And the letter I received stated very clearly, your predecessor burned his fingers. Don't you burn yours. That was the message. Keep out of it. It's none of your business. Today, again, some progress, such letters will no longer be written as UN leaders of today have started to appreciate the benefits of structural coherence and coordination in multi-sectoral circumstances. We consider this a valuable and far-reaching accomplishment and a milestone on the UN's road to liberation. At the same time, we are under no illusion that this road of change will have many potholes and many minefields for a long time to come. It's a quote. I'm stealing a little bit of intellectual property here from a woman that I appreciate enormously, and that is Hannah Arendt. When she said, I'm paraphrasing, freedom only comes after liberation. The UN's institutional freedom remains in the far horizon, is my addition to this. If this progress of such linkage has led us to the conclusion that the UN is no longer in the box, but partially out of the box, if you look a little bit closer at the cover of the book, it shows that despite such genuine progress of liberation, the UN, in Richard and my view, is still more in the box than out of the box, and a long distance away from independence. There is a third area of concern that I would like to detail because of the serious impact on the effectiveness of the operational UN. And that is a topic anyone who has served at senior level in the UN is well familiar with that, and that is the financing of the United Nations. All 9 UN Secretaries General have struggled to manage insufficient financial resources, compounded by late payments of assessed contributions. Secretary General have traveled, very embarrassing, have traveled regularly with a begging bowl to collect obligatory, not voluntary, obligatory annual payments that should be paid at the beginning of the year. The only P5 country that does that regularly over the years has been France. The other ones take it very lightly. And talking about late payments, the US is the leading donor. Yes, in absolute terms, the leading donor. But it's also the leading defaulter. Sometimes there are years when the US is paying nothing, coming close to the point where it loses its voting right. And when that is very close, they make some payment. And the fact that they don't pay in January of each year, but in October, is because their yearly budget year is from October. Very poor attitude towards the needs of a multilateral body like the UN. An exasperated Kofi Annan, I always like to refer to this, I like it a lot, observed on one occasion with a smile, "The Lord, God, has the wonderful advantage of working alone." That was his response. Over the years, the annual budget available to a UN Secretary General has always been small, pitifully small. In 2022, it amounted to 3.1 billion. Can I surprise you a bit when I say, well, first of all, it is less than 45 cents per person living on the planet, but it's also a budget that is smaller than the budget of the police department of New York City. That's the UN budget for you. The assertion by some Western governments, therefore, that they are making sacrifices with their payments to the UN is, quite frankly, bizarre. The per capita contribution to the UN budget, I checked, I was curious. I compared Bhutan, Germany, and the US. Bhutan pays on a per capita basis more than Germany and the United States. sacrifice in trying to find out the per capita contribution of the US, for example. I'm not good in mathematics. I couldn't understand how many zeros are there behind the behind the comma, until someone who's better equipped to do that helped me. It's a minuscule. There's nothing about a sacrifice. But the argument is we are sacrificing. Helene, before you cut me off, Louise, not much more, but a little bit. And our overall conclusion, I know it's a bit careful. I have to be a bit careful now. It's a bit tricky now to take our book and take out of it one paragraph. But there is one paragraph that sums it all up. And it's not meant, I remind you, we have no ideology involved. This is an empirically correct statement that follows here. I want to quote from the book. And those of you who acquire this book, voluntarily, of course, and there's no pressuring, will read on page 292, paragraph 2, the following. Evidence and assessments which have been set forth in this book show that the United States, in pursuit of its worldwide geopolitical interests by way of a unilateralist foreign policy, makes use of its military and economic power as a matter of national discretion rather than subject to the rule of law. This pattern of behavior, this is why I want to quote this whole thing, this pattern of behavior has been the single most clarifying explanation of both the turbulence in international relations and the often disappointing performance of the United Nations, end of quote. My second and last point here is the Security Council, especially its 5 permanent members, have to remember that their right to act on behalf of the other 188 member countries assumes, very important assumption here, that they carry out their responsibility in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. This is, refers to Article 25 of the UN Charter. We are deeply aware that the current world is a world of polarization, confrontation, inequality, exploitation, militarism, and disinformation, to which I referred. Yet, we also have noticed that an increasing number of governments, that's very, very interesting as a trend, increasing number of governments argue today that the right given by the General Assembly to the P5, to the Security Council, to act on their behalf should be withdrawn unless they are willing to comply with the law of the UN Charter. My last point here is both of us are in complete agreement that the toughest challenge of all in the reform debate will most certainly have to do with the creation of trust. The creation of trust, the conviction that the only win-win situation for a peaceful world order is the acceptance of global mindedness and teamwork. It's very interesting that King Abdullah yesterday in the General Assembly referred to exactly that point. He said that trust is crumbling. These were his words, not mine. And that trust, I would like to use the word re-establish. It would be a wrong word. To establish, there is no because there wasn't that trust soon after the 3 gray-haired men left Yalta. The real face of the UN was quite different. Now, I'm sure that Richard will explain much better than I can why a new UN can be a UN of empathy, of convergence, of compromise, and a word that I often use, I have to use, accountability. We cannot have a world without accountability. We cannot have a world of impunity, where people can wander into another country, destroy another country, and then go free. It's not possible. So accountability is crucial. And Richard will also do on both our part a presentation why we both deeply believe, fervently believe, in realism with hope. Thank you.
Is that okay? Let me first thank the Danish International Institute, Danish Institute of International Studies, for hosting this event and giving us this opportunity to describe what has been for us a pleasurable collaboration on a often frustrating subject. I won't repeat the gracious words that Hans accorded to almost everyone in the audience, because I don't expect the same exemption of time as. And I must say that in Helene's introduction, she made, I think she touched upon what I think was the animating impulse that led us to take on this challenging subject, which was that we were living at a time when the UN seemed increasingly irrelevant to the active foreign policy of the important countries of the world. And in my own country, in the US, the leadership rarely refers, in public at any rate, to the UN. It has a sense that it is responsible for global security, and especially after the Soviet Union. And it knows that the UN is not as easily manipulated as it had been in the early Cold War period. And so it doesn't feel either the need or the capacity to dominate within the UN. And that there's, of course, a silver cloud in that double sense. I also want to say that it's a bit difficult to follow Hans because he made such a comprehensive assessment that it leaves me only the most marginal space to add anything of significance. But given the protocol situation I find myself in, I'll have to say some words and hope that they resonate with at least one or two people. And let me make a further sort of, what shall I say, self-assessing comment, which is that I'm a very poor reader of my own books. And therefore, I am not nearly as expert as Hans is in discussing what we have already written. But the essential theme and the undertaking is, I think, close to both our hearts and a little bit close to our brains as well. And that gives me this sense that it's important to reinforce what Hans already said about World War II and the fact that the UN was shaped by the victors in World War II. It would not be the same organization had it not been that, if the birth process had been different. The context was extreme, the historical context was extremely different, extremely significant. And I like to say, put it provocatively, that in regard to the central mission of war prevention, the UN was designed to be weak. It was designed to fail because the most dangerous countries in the world were the ones that were exempted from the framework of the UN Charter by virtue of the veto. And it's a strange thing that a coalition of victors in the war will have this total kind of control over the destiny of an institution that's designed to keep the peace. And that was also a flaw in the war crimes trials that were held simultaneously. The crimes of the victors were exempt from any kind of scrutiny. And Hiroshima, Nagasaki, atomic bombings were not examined in any manner. And also the strategic bombing of civilian sectors of Germans and other cities. So one started with this idea that was basically a geopolitical idea, that the winners control history, and they have a moral mandate to shape the future. See, and we're still living with that legacy, almost 80 years later. We have not been able, the legacy is frozen because the amendment process of the UN Charter requires these 5 countries to assent to their own loss of control. In other words, if one was to restrict the veto, much less to repudiate it, it would require the consent of the countries that now have the discretion to choose when and whether they will prefer their strategic interests or their alliance interests over the global public good or human interest. And that's, you wouldn't want an organization shaped in that procedural way. And maybe one can summarize that reality by saying that the original sin of the framers of the UN was to accord primacy to geopolitics. Because what this has meant is that the UN, if the UN had no grounded capability to fulfill its own promises in the preamble to the UN Charter, which was very aspirational and talking about saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was deprived of that capability at the very beginning. And what the veto really means is that when it comes to global security and major war prevention, this is to be managed by these 5 powers. And not only these 5 powers, but as time proceeded, it was really 2 powers. It was really the P2 that dominated international relations throughout the Cold War. It was the Soviet Union and the United States. And they created a precarious system of balance. And that was the basis of war prevention. It was nothing in the UN Charter. The UN did some things on the margins, but the essence of world peace depended upon this equilibrium that was a matter of geopolitics and national security planning, not collective responsibility managed by, in any meaningful sense, by the UN. And if you take the Cold War as the first long experience after World War II, the second long experience is what has happened since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. And now what the reality is, that's a second reality. What the reality is that we no longer have a P2 geopolitical arrangement. We have a P1. The U.S. was the only surviving geopolitical actor that filled the vacuum created by the collapse of this balance, and what it provided was its sense of militarized geopolitics, with its bases all over the world and navies in every ocean. And the Ukraine war, in a important sense, represented a Russian attempt to restore the geopolitical balance that had existed during the Cold War. And that it's far from perfect. That you must warn me when I'm... Okay, I want to make then 4 very quick points that... Yes, I didn't make any of these gracious remarks, so I deserve some reward. I want to just end with 4 points of hope about, despite the darkness which is evident in what's happened, the unspeakable crimes in Gaza and the tragic developments in Ukraine, made more tragic by the U.S. refusal to allow a diplomatic solution, which was on the table early in the war, and it was certainly a provoked war, though not a justifiable one, but it was provoked. But that's not not a source of hope. What I would say is the most important source of hope is a reawakening of the global South, or the non-West. And by that I mean, let me put it more accurately, it's the second reawakening. The first reawakening was to the challenge of ridding the world of colonialism. And that occurred during the Cold War and was a major transformation of international political life, a major de-Westernizing of the international order. This second coming has to do with the fact that the governments of the South no longer trust the United States as a responsible leader. And the votes in the General Assembly have shown this kind of shift from a kind of passivity and reconciling themselves to a bad situation, but not something of this magnitude. And they also, especially in Africa, have come to the awareness that there is something I've called colonialism after colonialism, which, for instance, these French former colonies in Central Africa, like Niger, experience, where the French gave formal independence, but they kept the economic control by being able to manipulate the indigenous elites and had a security role. So they basically dominated the space. And now, in this period, there's important reaction against that, and a second kind of decolonization. And of course, the Israeli experience as a settler colonial project established after colonialism died is the primary expression of colonialism after colonialism. In reaction to that, the UN has been reinvigorated in relation to the International Court of Justice and the General Assembly. And the International Court of Justice's two opinions, one, the genocide rulings in response to South Africa's initiative, and the other, the advisory opinion in response to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly's response to that advisory opinion, which is one of the most assertive moves by the General Assembly in the whole history of the UN, in my judgment, and has given the International Court of Justice a new stature as an integral part of the kind of UN we want to see established. The way the ICJ has behaved during this horrible experience in Gaza is a bright shining light in the overall firmament of UN responses. And also there are other bright shining lights, like the Special Rapporteur for Palestine, who has been courageous throughout. But I believe this fusion of General Assembly and ICJ assertiveness is one way that the Security Council will be, over time, greatly weakened and its authority circumvented, unless it adapts to in some way and is not a voice of Western consensus that existed during the Cold War, for instance. And okay, yes, okay. Just the final things I wanted to say something about was civil society. Activism is much more conscious of the relevance of a strong UN, and the anti-Western coalitions like BRICS and the Chinese development cooperation frameworks. Both of those are very threatening to the UN because it shows that there are alternatives, and if the UN doesn't serve the peoples of the world, there are ways to get around that and create new forms of order. Sorry for exceeding my, thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's a long book and there's a lot to say, and I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but I'm also very excited, and I hope you are as well, to hear what Louise Riis Andersen has to say about the book. The word is yours, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to comment on the book. I think it's clear also what we've heard from your presentations, that much is wrong with the UN, much is wrong with the world. And I think the book, I would like to recommend it highly. It provides an impressive and comprehensive oversight of all the things that are wrong in the UN and some of the things that are wrong in the world. And importantly also, it outlines a way how to improve or fix the UN. I think it's an inspiring read, and it given me some, a lot of food for thoughts and reflections, and I would like to share a few of them with here, but I want to sort of initially just open by echoing the call that you make throughout the book for more responsible and prudent leadership, because I think there's a lot of crises, a lot of talk of different crises, financial crisis of trust, but I think most of all there is a crisis of leadership. And maybe this will be sort of my main point, that as we try to reform and fix the UN, we need to also look at what kind of leaders do we actually have, global leaders in the world to do that, to provide that. We may, think that the three men who were responsible for the UN Charter back in the days, that they weren't perfect, but I'm not quite sure we have any sort of leaders right now with the same kind of broad outlook or vision that goes beyond their own national ideas, but and that's another thing. So, and I think maybe that's what sort of the book it's called Realism with Hope, but it has a lot of idealism in it. I think it's actually quite idealistic and progressive, and I've often found myself to be sort of like an old cynical pragmatist, thinking, yeah, that's all fine and well, but in the real world, we have to deal with what is there. And I think that will actually be my sort of one of the main takeaways from reading the book, was thinking about it's actually a miracle that the UN exists to begin with. It has often been said if the UN wasn't there, we would have to invent it. But it is there, and it's actually still working. Despite all the flaws and all the problems, it is actually still working, and it's working almost 80 years it's been working, despite the P5 being the P5s, because the P5s have always been focused on pursuing their own national interests. It's not a new thing. They have done that throughout the 80 years. And national interests have always been high on the agenda of all the governments acting in the UN. It's part of the system, it's how it works. And the institutional dysfunctions have always been there. But still, this weird bumblebee keeps flying, even if it's not supposed to. So I think we have to look at, why does it do that? Why is it that it still works? And as I was listening to you, Richard, the geopolitics is an integral part of the UN system, but maybe part of the problem we have now is that we don't really have a clear geopolitical situation. Yesterday in the General Assembly, the Secretary General spoke of, the polarities that we used to have a bipolar system, then we had, as you mentioned, a unipolar, and now we're perhaps on the way, or probably on the way towards something that's multipolar. But he said right now we're in this purgatory of polarity, that we don't really know what kind of polarity we have, and that is what makes everything difficult and makes it so hard for things to function. But still, despite all of this, it's still working. The Security Council is still meeting. All the permanent members, they still continue to go there. They don't want to miss out and give the room to someone else. All the member states are still coming to New York for the opening of the General Assembly, and they still agree, and they still are able, despite all the divisions and the polarity or the polarization, they're still able to agree. For instance, on the Pact for the Future, which we have also, you mentioned a lot of the nobilities we have in the room. We also have Jens Vandel, who will, he knows very much about the Pact for the Future, if we should discuss that later in the Q&A. But so this, it continues to function as a political system. It also continues to function as an operational system, providing humanitarian assistance, development assistance, technical assistance, but also all of these very technical standards and agreements that allow the global system to work, like the International Postal Union is a UN agency. When we fly, there are UN regulations for how they can talk together on standards for flying and stuff like that. All of these, they're still working, but they're also under pressure, but they're still there. So we should not sort of dismiss it all, say it's not working, nothing is working, it's all wrong. There's a lot of things that are working, and maybe we should, as we try to look for the future of UN and the future we want for the UN, look at why is it working despite all of these flaws. And also the book, it goes back to the beginning of the UN, the original, you mentioned the original sin, but I would like to say maybe it's not so much an original sin, maybe it was actually quite genius what they did back then, because they made this organization that continues to not thrive, but at least function and perform important functions. So I would say the UN has always been a paradoxical creature. In the charter, it opens with "we the people," but all membership is only afforded to states, not people. There's a clear paradox there. It celebrates the sovereign equality of all its members, yet it gives 5 powers a special responsibility for policing, special privileges. There's another paradox there. And then it promises in the charter to combine all efforts to accomplish peace and security, development, human rights. Yet it has this institutional structure that, despite the progress you mentioned on interagency collaboration, it still has very much sort of silo thinking. This belongs to the peace and security pillar, this is development, this is human rights. So it's easy to criticize. When you look at this structure, it's very easy to criticize the UN and said, but this is wrong, and it has been also, you can criticize it from all different kinds of angles. So to some people, it's the state-centrism that's the sort of the original sin. To others, it's the veto. To still others, it's the bureaucracy. It's the international civil servants. It's all of these, all the UN officials and their bureaucratic interest and their self-interest. And so you can take a little piece of each and say, this is the main problem. This is where we should fix things. But I would say maybe we need all of these inconsistencies and paradoxes to keep that thing moving, because if we are to have a world organization that brings together all countries in the world and focuses on all aspects of human life, it has to be complex. You cannot have sort of a simple organization to do that. So you need of these. And maybe what you need is, and I think even if, as Richard also mentioned, it is very, very difficult to revise or to reform, to do fundamental reforms and change the pact, the UN Charter. It actually is still, the UN is very capable of evolving. The UN we have today is very different from the UN of the 1945. And I would sort of in conclusion point out, or not in conclusion, but as I'm closing, I mean, the P5 are still the same P5 in a sense, but then again they're not, because it used to be China, or it used to be Taiwan, now it's mainland China. It used to be the Soviet Union, now it's Russia. The UK used to be an empire. The things have changed also there. But that's sort of a little thing where I think some of the major trends that have occurred and where the UN has evolved in the past 80 years without altering the pact is that, first of all, it's gotten bigger, much bigger. It's a lot more member states, a much broader agenda, and it keeps expanding its agenda. Now in the Pact for the Future, there's a global digital compact. There's now also artificial intelligence is also being discussed. So it keeps expanding. That's one thing where the UN is changing, even without changing the charter. Another area where the UN is also changing and has changed is that it's much less state-centric than it was. It has opened up to a lot of engagement with civil society, with private business, with philanthropies, with regional organizations, all kinds of non-state actors. They do not have the right to vote in the General Assembly, and they cannot be sort of a member. But they are there, and they're included in the work of the UN increasingly. And this is maybe more of a speculative thing, we may discuss that also, but the UN of today is perhaps becoming less of a doer and more of an enabler. So the UN is not the one itself who's actually out there in the field doing the things, but it's setting up either ideas or frameworks or norms or sometimes logistical support behind the scenes to help other actors do these things. And these actors may be, it works on all levels. So these actors may be regional organizations, but it may also be individuals in a particular country that can take a UN idea and use it to criticize its own government, for instance. I think that's also an important element to keep in mind. Why are governments sometimes very hesitant to sign on to conventions? And if they didn't matter, they do matter because they can be used by different actors in other settings. So that's another thing we should sort of keep in mind as we criticize and think. But the UN isn't doing enough. It's right. There's a lot of things where we want the UN to do more, but we should also look at what is the UN still enabling others to do, and can it provide more of that role? So I think as we sort of look to the future and discuss the future of the UN and the reforms we want, I mean, there are things we can do without changing the charter. And are these some of the things is that the direction we want to push the UN in, or are there other things? So I think, I had, just one more thing. I wasn't quite sure whether to include this, but because there is, I keep saying we, and who are the we we're talking about? I mean, that's the main difficulty, because when it's 193 countries, there are, and I don't know how many are we now, 7-8 billion people. It's difficult. Who is the we? The universal we're talking about is quite difficult to sort of grasp. But there are two. When we talk about the UN, you also mentioned it, Hans, that we distinguish clearly between the UN, the first UN, which consists of member states, and the second UN, which consists of the bureaucrats, the civil servants, the secretariat. But the relation between these two is, I think, important to keep in mind. And where should we have the balance between the two? Where can we cannot force member states to work against their own interest. Trying to convince them to not pursue interest in the UN is futile. But what the UN can do is to enable them, again, the enabling thing, enable them to have a broader perspective when they define what is their national interest, to take a longer term perspective, to not have too short-sighted and too much of a transactional focus. And in order to do that, we have the secretariat needs to be independent. They need to have a stronger voice. So there is in the charter this Article 99 that provides for the Secretary General to bring to the attention of member states items that he thinks they should focus on. And there, I think, is a lot to be done in sort of strengthening the independent voice of the Secretary General and all the people that reports to him, in order to sort of push the member states to have a broader perspective when they define their national interests. And this again is something you can do without, it's already there in the charter as one of these, like the tension between human rights and national sovereignty. There are all these tensions built in, so it's just the balance of trying to push within that space. Thank you.
So much, Louise, for providing your thoughts on the book. Also, I would say, as a, what can you say, a critical fan of the UN. And before we move to the Q&A, I would like to invite Myat Thet Thitsar, who wrote one of the essays at the end of the book. And you have maximum 10 minutes, Myat Thet, so we have time for Q&A. I'm sorry to be, but I think I did tell you from the beginning around 10, so it's okay. We should have some time for discussion and questions. Oh, there we go.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I thank you, Helen, for encouraging me to write a note on these very significant issues of the world's humanity, the reform of UN. And secondly, I thank you, Hans and Richard, for giving a chance to the new generations to make a voice. And the reform of UN, I think, is a finding way of collaborating liberal forces in the world for justice, peace, and security of the humanity. I wrote in the book, I wrote the note titled Envisaging the UN as a mechanism of the world's collective liberal leadership to find non-violent solutions for humanity. I received an opportunity of writing the note as a voice of Myanmar. What would a Myanmar make a voice about UN reform? Yes, I like to make a loud voice that we Myanmar people are being, in their everyday life, immensely terrorized by its so-called state army. And now, hence, talk about UN's focus on national integrity, and then Louisa's point out the paradoxical, or even though the preamble started with the word "we," it is focus and pay the role of the states. Now, we Myanmar people in their everyday life were being terrorized by the so-called state. Actually, this terrorizing has been happening for many years in Myanmar, almost of a century, but it has been more extreme and violent, using mass destructive means like airstrikes and arson alive, since the people strongly and massively resisting against the Myanmar Army's coup that staged on the 1st of February 2021. Actually, on that day, newly elected parliament have to resume is the third parliamentary sessions after the 2020 general elections. People across Myanmar, the countries, towns, villages demonstrated peacefully. Over 400,000 civil servants and some 3,000 army personnel resorted to civil disobedience to express their opposition against the coup. But Myanmar army cracked down violently. How violently? That it means arrest, torture, and killed. If you arrested today, the next day or within a few weeks, your family will receive your dead body. And even this kind of wearing umbrellas by the youths, reading the 4/8 in memorial of the historic democratic revolution that happened on the 8th of August 1988, were arrested and tortured using means that will have lifelong physically disabled. People have no choice but to resort to armed struggle as they want to end this state terror in their generations. Armed struggle is the solutions by killing other humans. And now we learn that the armed struggle have a tremendous moral and social cost. And now we understand that very well that all armed solutions have dehumanization process. That's very painful. This is the most painful part of the solutions that we now finally resort to. But we have no choice. We don't have peaceful solutions. Many young people are now very familiar to the weapons. They know how to produce them, not only using them. Myanmar Army make frequent airstrike almost every day. In some months, almost every day. But people don't know that. The airstrikes on schools, IDP camps, markets, and residential areas. The airstrike didn't even stop when the people are being killed and displaced by highly disastrous floods and landslides that's currently happening in Myanmar. the worst floods in many decades in the country histories. Where is UN? What I see is UN is accommodating and facilitating the world power games while the people on the ground are dying every day. Myanmar people, without knowing that the two illiberal states, Russia and China, will veto against any good and effective solutions for them, they, at the very beginning of the revolution, eagerly expected R2P. What we reflect and analyze the overall war situations today, what I found out is that the main core issue is the clashes of liberal and illiberal forces. The current war crisis in fact reflect the ramifications of the clashes of liberal and illiberal forces. With the benefits of the digital and intellectual age, civil society are beginning to show the strength of bottom-up interventions that reducing the power grip of the powerful who are opposed to the expanding open society. Regrettably, illiberal backlashes are clearly visible internationally and nationally. Myanmar's democracy and more open society has long been challenged by such illiberal forces, especially by Buddhist nationalist movements developed and manipulated by Myanmar army. After failing to stop the momentum of this opening Myanmar society, the military finally bluntly assaulted it by its armed power. The international illiberal forces have effectively blocked international liberal forces that seek to help Myanmar's people free themselves from domination by these national illiberal tendencies. Myanmar is not the only example of the people who suffer from the clashes of liberal and illiberal forces. Myanmar society is just one part of the world's humanity suffering from such clashes. Humanity currently is at serious risk of being defeated by illiberal forces as they are extremely powerful economically, politically, and militarily. If illiberal forces prevail, there will not be no justice, no security, and no peace for humanity. The world needs a highly robust platform for collective liberal leadership to encounter illiberal forces effectively. A legitimate platform of collective liberal leadership cannot be achieved by only hosting governments of nation states. Civil society must be included as an integral partner for global decision making. The world urgently needs a powerful collective liberal forum. The United Nations needs to realize that it is painfully lagging far behind and that it urgently needs to introduce reforms to make its operations legitimate and effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Myat Thet, for that powerful addition to the previous speakers and to this book as well. And you didn't mention, like the first and the second picture you showed is that actually the Myanmar people have actually actively asked the UN, using both the R2P, the responsibility to protect concept, in demonstrations, calling on UN help. And in the last picture also, which is very famous and which went viral on social media, is the young man holding this sign in front of the main UN building in Yangon, the main city, not the capital city, but main city in Myanmar, deliberately calling on the UN to take action. This is actually in the early days, not currently.
And he himself was arrested.
And he was arrested for holding this sign. But we need to now spend the next half an hour to give you a chance to ask questions and provide comments. I please ask you to be as brief as possible, so that as many people as possible can get a chance to ask questions and comment. And I will collect 3 questions at a time, and then I will hand over the word to our panelists here, of course, principally Richard and Hans, but also Louise and Myat Thet. And Hans and Richard are also very welcome to respond to what Louise has contributed and what Myat Thet has contributed when I give you the word, after just collecting a few questions, because there might be some overlaps. But let's open the floor. Yes, Jens Vandel and the gentleman after. Yes, because we are live streaming, so.
Exactly. So let me just open by saying I'm Jens Vandel. I'm a former Undersecretary General and led the UN reform from 2019 to 2021. Now, thank you for the book. It is most timely. And 2 things is, with the Summit of the Future that has just been finished and the so-called adoption of the Pact of the Future, the Secretary General has 18 months to go, and a book like this can help a little bit to what reforms can he do. Secondly, in the Pact of the Future, it is mentioned that the next Secretary General should preferably be a woman, and that also means it can help frame some of that election agenda. A couple of quick observations. Richard Falk, you mentioned this second awakening of the South, and we saw that on the 22nd in September, when the Pact of the Future was to be adopted. The Russians stood up and said, this is a plot from the West, and it should be changed. Then Congo stood up and said, no, it's not a plot from the West. It represents us, and we put a vote that we should ignore you, Russia. So it was put to a vote. 143 said ignore Russia, and 7 did not. So Richard, I think you really identified something important, whether we call it second awakening or whatever, but I think it's true, the real, you can say, forces that we're seeing a lot come from the South. I get to the question, and that is that it seems both for the sustainability agenda, but also now most recently with the so-called Global Digital Compact, the UN is open up for cadence of getting experts in, create some kind of basis, and then move it out in the international process. And that leads me to this idea that we have discussed the first UN, the political, the second, the operational. We should probably start talking more about the third UN. And that is the us interacting with the first and the second UN. So the question to you is, the Secretary General goes out very much and talked about network multilateralism, and that is one of the ways he wants to find new entries into the system to create energy for action, but also for reform. What are your reflections on a term like network multilateralism? Thank you very much.
The gentleman behind, if you can also introduce yourself before you ask questions.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for this great inspiration. My name is Uffe Hvidkjær. I'm a founder of a citizen think tank, Europe Dialogue. I have one reflection and one question. And as mentioned, the Summit of the Future, is that the answer for the future? And the second, the question, I was very happy about the civil society voice here, because I'm also NGO. And I have been working for 2 years about Denmark in the world, because Denmark is going to be a member of the Security Council in 25-26. But at the same time, Denmark will be EU president in 25 and host a meeting in European political community. So how do you see the chance to combine the global and European perspective in 25 for a small nation? Thank you.
The third question here.
Thank you very much. I was the former special rapporteur on right to food between 2014-2020. My question is about opening UN representation to private sector and the civil society organizations, but the power balances between the private sector and civil society is significant, and this exactly comes to the decision-making processes, which is extremely dangerous. Do you have any kind of comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. And Hans, would you like to start by replying to some of these questions? I mean, you don't need to reply to all of them. You can also divide the answers between you, but...
Thanks a lot. Well, your point, the summit of the future, is that the answer? My clear reaction is it is not at all the answer, because it's again a state-centric effort to continue on the status quo basis. That's not what we want. I think what is absolutely necessary is that multilateralism and the way it represents itself structurally has to include the new forces on the block, not just governments. Civil society has to be there. NGOs, of course, there are now over 6,000 NGOs that have a status, an associated status with the Economic and Social Council of the UN. That's a good thing, but it's much too little. No issue of a world importance today should be debated in the General Assembly without the participation of civil society and the non-governmental sector. That's very much what I would suggest. And what we have seen coming out of New York during the last 4 days is, I said to my wife, there's a song called I Had a Dream, because it's a dream. It's not realistic. This huge list of items. We will have no more. Here is the former person on hunger, special rapporteur. Hunger will end is one of the action points. Well, tell me how it will end. We are not getting that. So I think I don't want to dominate here, but I wanted to say that this has to be much broader, the discussion of the future, the UN of the future, than before. And maybe a footnote here, the authority of the Secretary General has to be broadened. And we have in the UN Charter, Article 100 and 101, which make a strong reference to the independence of the UN. Well, let the UN Secretary General then have this independence in proposing, not just proposing, but also carrying out. It cannot be that you give me money and attached to the money are conditions. I want to have independent resources to do my job as a Secretary General. And maybe I know I have other things that I would like to say also to my former colleague here, the Under-Secretary General, about the awakening of the UN, the second awakening of the South. Well, whether the West-centric institution that we still have can expect to continue with business as usual is a very wrong assessment of the reality, because we have new players, and the countries that used to be yesterday colonies and today they're independent countries. Just like a young person becomes an adolescent and afterwards an adult, the countries of the South are adults today. They cannot be ignored any longer. And I think so the Second Awakening is, to me, a very important evidence that we can have some reason for hope that inclusivity will play a much greater role tomorrow than it is playing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Han. Richard, would you like to respond to?
I want first to say something in response to my colleagues on my left. Not necessarily to my left, but on my left. And that is, it's very important to remind us of the positive achievements and contributions of the UN despite all the friction and the notoriety given to the disappointments and to the shortcomings. And I think that's, the media is terrible about that. It just emphasizes the failures, and it creates a false image and understanding. At the same time, I would disagree slightly by saying we get what we expect from this organization, given the way the world is constituted, and we can't realistically expect much more. See, I think the whole impulse since World War I with the League of Nations was to find a way to moderate the war propensities of the state system. And I feel that it's done a very poor job with its main undertaking. In other words, I would give it I'm not a particularly hard grader, but I'd give it a D+. And we have to think about that as we can't accept that failure because we won't survive as a species if we don't really address that failure. And of course, I agree with Hans and what was said from the floor about the crucial importance of inclusivity when it comes to civil society. But I think we need a lot of creative thinking about what makes participation operationally relevant. We don't want just to give the seat at the table, which is a kind of gesture without any political impact. So when we think about participation, we have to think about effective mechanisms for making it tangibly relevant.
Thank you so much. Louise?
Thank you. I agree, of course, that we shouldn't just accept that this is as good as it gets and we'll never get anything better. But even, I think, among the criticism that are raised against the UN is also people arguing against the whole universality of the system, saying that a country like Russia should be ejected from the UN because of its actions in Ukraine, or others wants to throw out the United States or China, or there are many different people who want to throw out different member states of. So the main question is, do we want to have an organization that is universal in its membership, that brings together all of these with all of this? And then with that also comes these limitations, that how to have such a diverse body agree on something. So, I mean, that's, I think, probably my main, that there are limitations to how much sort of, when we have a universal organization, how far we can go in agreeing on things and making them effective. I think that would be sort of my pragmatic limitations on our expectations. But even the fact that we still have the Security Council and they still come, that's the only place where they meet. And I think that has value in itself. It may not, we have now not all of these systems of trust that we used to have during the Cold War. They have sort of gradually been downgraded, and the agreements on disarmament also, stuff like that is slowly vanishing. That's a major problem. But that there still is a place where they meet, even though they strongly disagree, has value in itself. And then there was a question on the role of sort of the power balance between civil society and private companies. I fully agree. I've written about it early on when there's the Paris Peace Forum, which is one of, there's so many different initiatives trying not to replace necessarily the UN, but have, you know, other forums where you can have a global conversation on global issues and global problem solving and bringing different actors together. And one of the things that struck me, I was at the Paris Peace Forum and earlier at the Riis dialogue, which is another one of those outside of the UN settings, where they bring in multi-stakeholder actors. And so there are the civil society, and they're not that strong and not that many. And then there are like major companies, and they have tremendous banners, and they're just very visible. And they're treated on par on this, as if it's a level playing field. Of course it's not. But the problem is that how do you keep someone out and say you are not a valid member? That's one aspect. Who are the proper civil society representative that we want to include, and who are those that we don't want to invite? That's a different discussion, or difficult discussion. And the other thing is also the whole, we talked briefly on financing, but the mobilizing of financing is a major issue. And a lot of the money that we need to mobilize to address some of these global problems, they are in private pockets. They're not in the government pockets. You know, we can't solve these issues only with voluntary contributions from donor governments. So we need also with finance or climate financing, we need to somehow mobilize private funds. So we need to, I mean, we can't exclude them, but it is, I mean, our whole system of accountability is built on the state system. How do we include non-state actors in this and somehow keep them accountable? That's, it's just another dilemma. But
I want to take very briefly, because I want to give the audience one last.
It's very clear that theoretically what you have said is important. The private sector must have a greater role. The UN has made very dubious experience with the private sector. The private sector has exploited very often, under the banner of the UN, its innocence which didn't exist, pursuing its own commercial interests. So only one sentence, and that is, yes to the private sector, but very stringent credentials must be transparently and convincingly there before I would feel comfortable to invite a private company to join the UN in any capacity.
If you have anything to say, can you save it for the next round of answers, and we'll start with you. But I have a first question here from Mike Spears, and please, if anybody else, put your hand up.
You mentioned the interesting role that is being played by the International Court of Justice, and you suggested that there is some kind of an alliance emerging in your awakening of the global south between the General Assembly and the Court of Justice, or the legal system more generally. I mean, we talk a lot about the rule of law, at least in the area which I've been working on, environmental policy, natural resource exploitation. The rule of law has been an important concept. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on how the United Nations could take the rule of law a step further, not only with reference to genocide and so on, but more generally in helping to establish transparent, accountable, legally recognized systems of governance. Thank you.
A few words on who you are, just to present yourself.
That's fairly irrelevant.
Oh, Stephen. Okay, that's okay. But Mike is partly with DIIS and used to be in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just as a background.
Yes. Hello, my name is Stephen Jensen. I work as a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And I wanted to pick up on a point I think Hans von Sponeck mentioned about the necessity of accountability. That's a relatively new term, I think, that came into usage around 1990 or something like that. And it's also a famously slippery term. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how you envisage these accountabilities, because it's something that has been debated, I mean, since the 90s, but it's very rare to see the states actually actively engage on that. I say that from having previously worked at UNAIDS. Anytime there was something we tried to kind of push on the states and governments, it was kind of a no-go. It was always putting it back on the secretariat on the program. So I was wondering, and maybe some of that is in the book, like how do we envisage taking the accountability agenda forward so it actually matters? Thank you.
Yeah, and one last question before we... No? Then we go back to the panel. Myat Thet, do you have anything to add to the previous? No? Maybe we start then with Richard this time. Yeah.
Just a short comment again on what you said about universality, which I think is very important, but you have to recognize that Article 5 and 6 of the UN Charter itself says if members violate the fundamental principles, Article 5 says the General Assembly can suspend them, and Article 6 said that they can exclude them. Do we pick and the broader question is, do you pick and choose the articles you like and get rid of the parts you don't like? I mean, that it's a question for constitutional law people and other people. The rule of law, how do you advance the rule of law within the UN setting? It's a question that I've spent whole courses trying to wrestle with. And it's a, of course, central issue. And just to put one idea before one, and I think that the way we teach international law within our law schools is an important aspect of this, and the way the media understands international law. I've argued for a long time that the U.S. would be much better off as a prosperous and secure country if it had adhered to the basic framework of international law ever since the Vietnam War, essentially. And I think until these powerful countries can be made to see that in the present world context, respecting international law is in their national interest in almost all matters bearing on environmental protection and global security. And in that sense, I think there's a great role for creative pedagogy, both within civil society and within governmental circles. If I could say something about this role that the ICJ and General Assembly played, which I think was in the case, I think the ICJ lived up to its reputation as a professional judicial body that tries to get the relevance of law correctly interpreted. And impressively, because of the high political salience, the judges on the court did not act in accordance with what their governments were advocating. In other words, there was judicial independence of a type that you don't see in other parts of the UN. So I think it's a good model of what it would mean to have an independent major organ of the UN function in that way. And just one more point, that part of the creativity of the court was to basically instruct the UN and its member states that it had an obligation to implement the findings in an advisory opinion, which in a sense would circumvent the veto in the Security Council. And the General Assembly responded in this resolution where it called upon Israel to withdraw from what it regarded as an unlawful continuation of the occupation. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Hans or Louise, who wants to have a go? You had a very question, Hans, on the accountability.
I just want to be, I'm careful because I'm not a lawyer, I don't have a legal background, but I'm absolutely delighted that the word accountability is becoming more and more slippery as it is. I agree with that. More part of the discourse about international relations. We cannot have, in Baghdad, where I lived and served and saw, we cannot have a situation where a law is applied to the loser, but not to the winner. Tony Blair and Bush belong to the court just as Saddam Hussein was put before the court. That never happened. So we now have more and more these kind of circumstances where big powers say, to hell with the UN, we do what we want, and impunity prevails. Cannot. So we cannot avoid, or we shouldn't avoid as civil society, to have a discussion on what does it take to ensure that accountability does take place. And in that context, I would say this is part of the UN for the future package of UN reform requirements, that the ICC, sorry, not the ICC so much, but the ICJ is equipped to issue legally binding decisions. That has to happen. And only when that happens do we get a chance that impunity no longer prevails. So I would hope that that subject of accountability becomes a major issue in the UN reform debate. More to say, but I want to stop here.
It's time, but I want to give you a chance. Myat Thet, you get the last word of today.
Yeah. What I would like to point out and raise the question is the the role of civil society in finding collective solutions and in UN reform, because when it comes to civil society, as you said, like private sectors, it's sometimes very controversial. Then again, we have to, in that case, I think we have to apply the international laws and norms. Especially, I like to point out the norms, like human rights declarations. That will be the basics to determine the values of the civil society, the grounded values of the civil societies. That's what I mean is, in the world, we usually have, based on those fundamental norms of the humanities. I think this is also one of the best things that UN have developed, UN have given to us in order to make this criteria, this liberal society, illiberal society. And when I say liberal, I don't mean this neoliberal things. What I mean is the liberal means the values of humanities, the values of democracy, kindness, respects, and values to each other. So this surely exists, and this surely knows as a human beings is very good and very positive for the interest of the humanity. So my point is, at the end of the day, what UN have given us the best is this grounds of international norms, the norms of the humanities. Then we can rely on those norms to decide, to determine the fundamental values of the civil society in order to make a forum of this liberal collective forces. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the four of you. Thank you for sharing your insights on the book, Professor Falk and Dr. Hans. And thank you to the audience here and also online. And please don't forget that if you are curious and want to read more, the book is for sale at a discount here in the auditorium. But otherwise, I wish you a safe trip back home and a good evening. Yeah, thank you.